9,000 years ago, a woman climbed a ladder to the roof of her house, stepped down through a hole in the ceiling, and went to sleep on a platform directly above the bones of her grandmother. She did this every night. So did everyone she knew. There were no streets outside her door. There was no door. The only way in or out was up through the roof, across the rooftops of her neighbors, and down again into another dark, warm, windowless room where somebody else was also sleeping above somebody else's dead. For 1,400 years, in a place we now call Çatalhöyük, this was what it meant to go home. We call it the first city. The archaeologists who have spent half a century digging into its mound use the word cautiously, because almost nothing about this place matches what that word means to you now. No palaces, no temples, no marketplace, no king, no public square. 8,000 people living wall to wall to wall in a honeycomb of mud brick boxes for 70 generations, and nothing we recognize as government, nothing we recognize as law, nothing we would now call a street. And yet they held, longer than Rome held, longer than the modern nation-state has existed, longer than any empire you have ever heard the name of. By the time the pyramids were built, Çatalhöyük was already a ruin under the grass. By the time Sumer invented writing, the people of this place had been gone for 1,000 years. When you hear the word civilization, this is what came first. And almost everything you think civilization requires, they did without. Over the next hour, we are going to walk through their rooms. We are going to climb their ladders, feel the smoke in our eyes, trace our fingertips along walls repainted 450 times. We are going to lift a reed mat from the floor and find what is sleeping beneath it. And at the end, when the city empties, and it does empty, without a battle, without a plague, without any reason we can name, we are going to stand on the mound with the last woman to leave, and we are going to ask what exactly was lost. Because the first city is not a stepping stone on the way to the cities we know. It is something older, and it has been trying to tell us something for 9,000 years. It is time to listen. To understand why Çatalhöyük matters, you have to understand how close to nothing came before it. 7,500 years before the Common Era. The last glaciers of the Pleistocene have pulled back north. The great megafauna, the woolly mammoth, the giant deer, are gone or going. Wetter Earth has been unfolding for 3,000 years, and across the curved rim of land we call the Fertile Crescent, something small and unprecedented is happening. People are staying put. For the 200,000 years your species has existed, the answer to almost every problem has been to walk. Hunger, drought, disease, a bad neighbor. You walk. You follow the herds. You follow the seasons. You carry what you can, and you leave what you cannot. And nothing you build outlives the wind. For reasons we are still arguing about, the walking stops. In southern Anatolia, 600 miles east of the Konya Plain, a small community has already raised the pillars of Göbekli Tepe and is in the long, deliberate process of burying them again. That site is 1,000 years older than Çatalhöyük will ever be. By the time our mound begins to rise, Göbekli Tepe is already a memory, already a story told by grandmothers. Wheat and barley are beginning to grow in rough patches, not quite tame yet, not quite wild. Sheep have started following people instead of running from them. Pressed and dried in the sun is becoming a wall. Your oldest companion, has been a companion for thousands of years already, and into this slow awakening, marshy plain, watered by two rivers and shadowed by a pair of volcanoes, a group of human beings walks and decides they are going to stay, not for a season, not for a generation, for as long as anyone now living can imagine. That is the moment this story begins. And the first thing they do, before the walls, before the murals, before the dead under the floor, is pick a place. They pick a slight rise on the eastern riverbank, though they cannot possibly know it yet, the exact spot where a mound will grow for 14 centuries. They pick where home will become a word. There is a word we need, and English does not quite have it. Çatalhöyük. Tepe. In the languages spoken across the ancient Near East, these are the words for what Çatalhöyük actually is. Not a city in the sense of Athens or London or New York, a body of earth and broken walls and compressed lives, lifted slowly above the plain by the accumulation of itself. Here is how it happens. You build a house. Mud brick walls, plastered inside and out, a flat roof of timbers and reeds and clay. You live in it for 70, maybe 100 years. Generations pass. The walls crack. The roof begins to sag. The smell of a century of cooking fires and buried ancestors is so deep in the plaster that no amount of renewal can lift it. So you do not repair. You do not abandon. You do something stranger. You dismantle the upper walls. You fill the lower half of the house, deliberately, ritually, with clean, dry earth. You level the floor of your old home into the foundation of a new one. Directly on top of the bones of your grandmother and the hearth your mother cooked at, you build again. The new house sits precisely where the old one stood. Sometimes the same outline, sometimes the same hearth position, sometimes the very same oven, relined with fresh clay. Your dead stay beneath you. Your family's fires stay in the same square of floor. The only thing that moves is the horizon, because now you are a little higher up in the world. Do this 18 times, 20 times, 40 times, and the plain beneath you lifts. Not metaphorically. Çatalhöyük today rises 20 meters above the Konya Plain, 65 feet of compressed homes, 65 feet of generations stacked in place like pages in a book. The mound is not a thing people built. The mound is the people themselves, layered, which means that what we are excavating is not architecture. It is memory, given shape. Every shovel we turn at Çatalhöyük goes down through a century of held ground. The deepest layers are from 1100 years before the Great Pyramid was planned. The uppermost layers are contemporary with the first written word in Sumer. And in between, in that 65 feet of patient earth, is the longest continuous story any community of human beings has ever told about a single patch of ground. That is what the word tell means in the old Arabic and Turkish sense. Not a hill, not a ruin. A tell is a place that remembers. Now climb up with me. Imagine you are standing at the base of the mound in the year 7000 before the Common Era. The plain behind you is flat, crossed by a slow river. In the hazy distance south, you can see the twin cone of Hassan Dağ, a volcano still, occasionally venting smoke. The air smells of river mud, wood smoke, sheep, and something sharper, the sweet acrid tang of fresh clay plaster drying in the sun. The mound rises, but there is no gate, there is no wall. In any direction, a single opening you could walk through. What you see is a cliff made of houses. The outermost walls of the outermost homes form a continuous surface, Flat, white, blank. No windows at your eye level. No doors at the ground. Just the featureless outer skin of a settlement that has turned its back on the world the way a body of cells turns its outer membrane to the weather. To enter, you climb. A ladder rests against the outer wall. You set your foot on the bottom rung and you go up, 15 feet, 20, and when you reach the top, you do not step into a street. There are no streets here. There will not be a street in the world yet for another 4,000 years. You step onto a plaza made of roofs. The entire top of Çatalhöyük is a single uneven surface of flat, the rooftops of hundreds of houses, pressed edge to edge, tilting slightly with the profile of the mound beneath them. In good weather, this is where the city lives. Women grind wheat at querns set up in the open air. Children run barefoot across the warm clay. Ovens, shared, communal, breathe smoke into the afternoon. Baskets of drying figs. The clack of flint being worked. The smell of meat. If you want to visit your sister, you walk across roofs. If you want water, you cross roofs to a shared well, or descend a ladder into one of the narrow alleys that occasionally cut between house clusters. If you want to go home, you find the hatch in the roof that belongs to your family, and you climb down. Down into darkness. Down into the smell of wood smoke and lamp oil and 14 generations of plaster. Down to the floor where your dead are sleeping. There is no king here. We have looked, half a century of looking, and there is no palace, no royal district, no differentiated architecture of power. The largest houses are not much larger than the smallest. The most decorated are not always the richest in goods. Some walls are covered in paintings. The house 2 doors over from the same generation is blank. There is no temple. Not one structure at Çatalhöyük is recognizably set aside for shared worship. And the sacred, whatever it is happening inside the homes. It is happening in every home. In some sense, the temple. There is no marketplace, no workshop district, no evidence of specialized quarters for the obsidian knappers, the bead makers, the weavers. Each house does its own work, side by side with the house that does its own work for 14 centuries. And here is the question nobody has been able to fully answer. The question that will not leave you alone. 8,000 people, 70 generations. No chief, no priest, no standing army, no written law, no division of labor beyond the household. It worked for longer than any civilization since. How? Step down off the ladder and let your eyes adjust. The room is small, about 5 meters on a side, 25 square meters, the footprint of a modern studio apartment. The ceiling is low enough that a tall man would lift his hand and brush the reed beams. There are no windows. There is no second story. There is no separate bedroom, no bathroom, no hallway. This single room, this dim rectangle of beaten earth and whitewashed plaster, is the whole of your home. The light comes from 2 sources, the ladder hole above, a bright square of sky during the day, a shaft of starlight at night, and the hearth set into the south wall, where a small fire of dung and scrubwood burns most of the time, and an oven of baked clay stands beside it. The floor is not flat. It is terraced, subtly, into distinct zones. Down near the hearth, the southern half of the room, the plaster is darkened with decades of smoke and cooking. This is the dirty side. Here is where grain is ground, meat is cut, bread is turned. Here is where the day works. At the other end, the cleaner, higher platforms along the north and east walls. The plaster is pale, fresh, sometimes painted, always renewed. This is where the family sleeps. This is where the family sits in the evening. And beneath these platforms, almost without exception, in every house at Çatalhöyük, the dead are laid. We will come back to the dead. For now, look at the walls, because the walls are what make this room unforgettable. They are white, not the white of bleached paint, but of lime plaster so fine it reflects the firelight like the inside of a shell. And they are smooth. They are so smooth that when archaeologists peel sections of them away from the mud brick behind, the plaster lifts off in sheets thinner than paper. Now look closer. You are looking at one layer. Beneath it is another. Beneath that, another. In one well-preserved wall at Çatalhöyük, researchers counted 450 distinct layers of plaster in a thickness of 10 centimeters. 450 coats. The walls of the house were being replastered on average roughly once a month for generations. Stop for a moment and sit with that number. If you repainted a wall in your home once a month, beginning when you moved in and never stopping, it would take you almost 38 years to accumulate what the family in this house accumulated. And this is not a museum. This is not a shrine. This is a living room, a kitchen, a place where children were born and people made love. And somebody sat up late and could not sleep and watched the smoke curl through the ladder hole. Every month, or near enough, somebody in this family took a smooth wooden trowel and laid down another thin whisper of pale clay. We do not know why. The simplest answer: soot, grease, mildew. The practical need to keep a dark room bright is part of it. Fire leaves its mark quickly on white walls. But archaeology has a way of undermining the simple answer, because the replastering was not only on the smoke-stained south wall, it was also on the clean, untouched north platform. It was on walls behind benches that nobody could see. It was, in some rooms, behind images and figures that had been freshly painted days before, and which the next coat of plaster would erase forever. Something else was happening in those layers. Something that had to do with keeping the house right, with returning it, on a rhythm, to a kind of fresh silence, as if the accumulated living of 30 days had to be buried under a white skin, and another 30 days of living could begin. Archaeologists have a technical word for this kind of periodic renewal. They call it ritual. But the word in English carries too much of the temple with it. What was happening at Çatalhöyük was not the ritual of a priesthood. It was the ritual of a household. And we need to sit with how strange this is, that for these people to be alive in a place meant to return it over and over to a white beginning. Every month in the first city, 8,000 people rewrote the inside of their homes. Now lift the sleeping platform. It will come up in sections. The plaster crackles. Beneath the painted clay is a layer of packed earth, and beneath that, wrapped in a reed mat that has been folded with the care of a blanket folded around a sleeping child, is a body, tightly flexed, knees drawn up nearly to her chest, arms folded across her breast, head bowed forward. The position is deliberate. The body was bound in this posture before rigor set, sometimes with cords, sometimes by simple pressure, held in place until the muscles and tendons had given up their resistance to the new shape. She has been placed in the earth directly beneath the platform where the living of this house sleep. Not in a cemetery outside, not in a crypt below a temple, not even in a separate chamber. Her bones are the foundation of the mattress above. When her daughter lies down at night, she lies down on top of her mother. When her granddaughter is born, she is born above her grandmother. This is not an accident. This is not an emergency burial. This is the rule. At Çatalhöyük, as far as we can tell, the dead do not leave the house. The pattern holds across more than 200 excavated burials. Men, women, children, infants. Often wrapped in reed or woven fabric that has rotted away, but left its imprint in the soil. Some interred whole, soon after death. Others clearly held elsewhere for months. Excarnated, perhaps, on platforms where vultures pick the flesh clean, and then the clean bones brought home, sometimes missing the skull, because the skulls had their own path. The skulls, in a few cases, traveled further than the rest. They were removed after burial. They were washed. They were, in at least one famous burial, plastered and painted. A human face rebuilt in red ochre over bone, and then held by a living family for a generation or more, used in ceremonies we can only guess at, before finally being laid back in the earth beneath another woman's bed. Every home was built above its ancestors. Try to feel what that meant in the practical sense. When you woke in the night to add a stick to the fire, you were walking on your grandmother. When your child first learned to crawl, she crawled over her great-grandfather. When you made love, when you gave birth, when you died, all of it happened in the same small room where the people you came from were slowly becoming part of the floor. In the modern West, we have built an enormous distance between the living and the dead. We have funeral homes, cemeteries, grief counselors. The bodies of our parents go into the ground in a different postcode. We visit them, sometimes when the weather is fine. We bring flowers. We leave. The people of Çatalhöyük did the opposite. They did not let the dead leave. They built the dead into the architecture itself, and they built themselves on top. What does that do to a mind? We can only imagine. But one thing we can say with some confidence: the people who slept above the bones of their grandmothers for 70 generations did not conceive of the house as a thing. They conceived of the house as a body made of earth and plaster, and the dead and the living, all of them together, continuous, growing up through time, the way a tree grows up from its roots. You did not own the house. You were the latest layer of it. And when your time came, you went down into the floor and became the layer someone else slept on. Now light a second lamp and turn toward the north wall. In many of the houses at Çatalhöyük, not all, but enough that it is clearly part of the grammar of this place, the pale plaster is not blank. The reds come from ochre, ground from iron-rich earth. The blacks come from manganese or from charcoal. A few rarer greens and blues from rarer minerals. The palette is small. The imagery is extraordinary. Leopards in pairs face each other across doorways, claws extended, spots rendered in dotted rosettes. A headless human figure dances among them. Vultures, enormous, unmistakable, swoop low over tiny splayed human bodies, beaks down, wings spread. In one remarkable painting, a bull is surrounded by running stick figures, some with bows, some with what appear to be drums, some naked, some clothed, and the whole scene pulses with the tension of a hunt or a dance or something that is neither. And in one house, on a wall that was carefully replastered over within a generation, somebody painted the earliest known image in the world of a volcano in eruption. Two stacked cones rise on the left side of the composition, the upper one venting streams of bright, jagged red over a clustered grid of small boxes. What most scholars believe is the town itself, the rooftops of Çatalhöyük, seen from above, laid out in the same honeycomb pattern the archaeologists would one day excavate. Above the town, the mountain is exploding. The debate about this painting is still alive. Is it really the twin-peaked Hassan Dağ, the volcano that rises on the southern horizon of the Konya Plain? Is it really an eruption or just a stylized mountain with textured slopes? The dating of the painting, around 7,300 years before the Common Era, coincides with a known volcanic event on that volcano, but the match is not certain. What is certain is this: 9,300 years ago, somebody in a small, windowless room painted what they had seen the sky do and what they had seen their city do beneath it. And then, within a month, or a year, or a generation, somebody else laid a fresh coat of white plaster over the whole thing and began again. And that is the strangeness of Çatalhöyük art. It was not meant to last. Nothing on these walls was made for posterity. The paintings were made, lived with, and buried. Some murals we have recovered are the 12th layer of painting in a sequence. Some were visible for a week. Some, almost certainly, were painted in preparation for a single ceremony: a birth, a death, the installation of new horncores in the wall, and covered the next morning. This is the thing that trips up the modern mind. We think of art as a monument, as something made to outlast its maker. The cave paintings of Lascaux, the Venus of Willendorf, the pyramids of Giza, all aimed, however desperately, at permanence. Çatalhöyük art aimed at something else entirely. It aimed at the present. It served a purpose in its moment, and its moment was enough. Which means that when we stand in front of a Çatalhöyük painting today, 10 feet underground in a dig shelter in central Turkey, we are looking at something its makers never expected us to see. We are overhearing a conversation that was not meant to survive. The leopards, the vultures, the volcano. They were not making a statement to history. They were doing something inside the house for the people inside the house, and when the doing was done, they went back under the white. The walls were not a gallery. The walls were a practice, and once a month, the practice was renewed. So who were they? Practically. What did they eat? What did they make? How did they live? Not as an idea, but as a body on a Tuesday in spring. Start with the fields. In the marshy margins of the Konya Plain, the people of Çatalhöyük cultivated a handful of cereals, wheats of several varieties, barley, a little rye, and legumes like lentils and peas. The grain was stored in small baskets and clay-lined bins inside the houses, sealed against mice and damp. Wild plants still mattered: pistachio, almond, tubers, greens gathered from the wet meadows. They were farmers, but they were not yet farmers in the way the people of later Mesopotamia would be. The field had not yet fully swallowed the forest. Their sheep were small, lean, and central. Bone isotopes show that sheep, and to a lesser extent goats and cattle, were the main source of animal protein. Hunting continued: wild boar, aurochs, deer, but it was no longer primary. The herds were managed, moved between grazing grounds, probably tended by family groups who spent days or weeks away from the mound with their animals, and came back to sleep above their ancestors. Look at the tools. Obsidian, volcanic glass, jet black, glinting, sharper than surgical steel when freshly knapped. Çatalhöyük sat on one of the great obsidian routes of the ancient world, a trade network that brought raw volcanic stone down from Cappadocia, 150 kilometers to the northeast, and sent finished blades and cores out in every direction. Çatalhöyük obsidian has been found in sites across Anatolia, in the Levant, in Cyprus. Somebody in this mud brick city was making blades that 500 miles away, somebody else was using to cut bread. And yet, there is no specialized obsidian workshop, no district of knappers. The stone was being worked, as far as we can tell, inside the houses, household by household. Somebody's uncle, somebody's mother-in-law. The distinction between craftsman and farmer did not yet exist. The pottery is humble and comes late. In the lower layers of the mound, there is almost none, and basketry and wooden bowls filled its role. The weaving was fine. The figurines are famous. You have seen one of them, even if you do not know it. A small seated woman, fat, fleshy, her hands resting on two flanking leopards, found in a grain bin at Çatalhöyük in 1961. She is sometimes called the Mother Goddess. She is, beyond that, one of the most famous contested objects in archaeology. Was Çatalhöyük a matriarchy, an early egalitarian culture that worshipped a great mother? The earliest excavator, James Millart, certainly thought so. His interpretation traveled out of the dig and into the broader culture, where it became a foundational story for goddess-centered spiritualities in the 20th century. Half a library of paperback books rests on that figurine. The trouble is, when Ian Hodder took over excavations in the 1990s and began systematically studying every category of evidence, the matriarchy thesis did not survive contact with the data. Men and women at Çatalhöyük ate the same foods. They did the same work, by and large. Their burials were, if anything, indistinguishable. No richer goods for women, no richer goods for men. The boneware of their bodies shows similar patterns of labor. This was the least gender-differentiated society we have ever excavated. But that is not a matriarchy. That is an equality so old, it predates the possibility of a matriarchy. The distinction had not yet been sharpened into a blade. What they were was something even stranger and even more difficult to name. They were a people for whom the household, not the tribe, not the king, not the priesthood, was the engine of everything. Food, ritual, family, craft, death, renewal, art, memory, belief. All of it happened in the same small room. And the same small room, somehow, held all of it together for 1,400 years. Before we go back up to the rooftops to finish that question, step for a moment off the mound. Çatalhöyük did not happen in isolation. It is easy, looking at the excavation photographs, to picture the first city as a lonely thing. A strange white honeycomb rising out of an empty plain on an empty earth. For its entire 1,400-year run, Çatalhöyük was part of a world. 600 miles to the southeast, in the highlands of the Levant, the town of Jericho was already ancient when Çatalhöyük began. Its famous stone tower, the oldest known piece of monumental architecture on Earth, had been standing for 2,000 years already. Its walls, and there were walls at Jericho, unlike at Çatalhöyük, real stone walls thick enough to climb, were being maintained by people who did not paint their dead into the family altar. Further east, in northern Mesopotamia, small Neolithic villages were experimenting with pottery that the Çatalhöyük people had barely begun to make. 1,000 miles south, in the Upper Nile, pre-dynastic Egyptians were still walking the old walk. not yet staying. Across the sea to the west, the first farmers of Europe were just beginning to move across Thrace and the Aegean, carrying the wheat and the sheep and the habit of staying put with them. Some of the houses they would build in the next 1,000 years would look uncannily like the houses of Çatalhöyük, small, clustered, hearth-centered. That is not a coincidence, but it is also not a copy. It is what an idea does when it travels in the bodies of the people who believed in it. And up in the Cappadocian highlands, 150 kilometers northeast, the volcanoes were still feeding the trade route that fed Çatalhöyük. Obsidian flowed south in long strings of pack carriers, hand to hand, village to village. Each blade that reached Çatalhöyük had passed through other hands first. Each blade that left Çatalhöyük would pass through other hands again, moving out in a web that reached the Mediterranean coasts and the island of Cyprus and the far edges of the Anatolian plateau. We have grown used to thinking of the Neolithic as slow, as a time when nothing much happened. This is because we measure history in centuries and the Neolithic measures itself in millennia. But inside those millennia, the world was busy. Ideas moved, seeds moved, sheep moved, people, whole lineages of people, whole lines of women carrying their mother's ways of painting a wall, moved and kept moving, and settled and moved again. Çatalhöyük sat in the middle of that web, at its own particular node, and stayed still. That is the remarkable thing. In a world where ideas and people were already flowing, the first city chose stillness. It chose to dig down instead of out. It chose the vertical stack of layered houses over the horizontal sprawl that every later city would eventually choose, and in making that choice, it kept something the sprawling cities could not keep. It kept the memory of where the first hearth had been lit. So come back to the question we left open on the rooftops. 8,000 people, 70 generations, no ruler, no priest, no visible hierarchy of any kind. The honest answer is that we are still working it out. But over the last 3 decades of careful excavation, a picture has been emerging, and it does not look like any of the societies the word civilization has trained you to imagine. Start with what is not there. At Çatalhöyük, there are no palaces, there are no temples, there is no central storage facility, no granary of the kind that made the later pharaohs rich by controlling who ate when. There are no walls around the town, and no evidence of specialized warriors. In 200 documented burials, there is not a single grave that stands out. The wealthiest person at Çatalhöyük, by their grave goods, carried out of this life what everyone else carried: a string of beads, a polished obsidian mirror, the fur of a small animal, the plaster of their own house. No crown, no scepter, no hoard. This is, to put it mildly, unusual. Every city we know from later history is stratified. From Ur to Uruk, to Memphis, to Rome, the rich bury themselves differently from the poor, and archaeologists can see it 1,000 years later in the ground. At Çatalhöyük, that stratification does not exist. For 1,400 years, whatever held this place together held it flat. Now look at what is there. The house is there. And the house, at Çatalhöyük, is doing the work that palaces and temples and granaries do in later civilizations. The house stores the food. The house performs the ritual. The house holds the dead. The house teaches the children their craft. The house paints its own walls with the images that matter. The house buries its own ancestors beneath its own floor. and the next generation of the house builds on top of that. Who has directed excavations at the site for over 25 years has a name for what this was. He calls it History House Logic. The house was not a building. The house was a lineage, a continuous identity that persisted through the bodies of its members, the position of its hearth, the rhythm of its replastering, the stack of its dead, and that identity is what the generations were loyal to. In a society without chiefs, something has to hold people to the place and to each other. At Çatalhöyük, what held them was this: the long, patient work of being one house in one spot for centuries. The work of keeping the hearth in the same position your grandmother cooked at. The work of burying her where she could be the floor your children slept on. The work of repainting the walls every month, because to stop was to lose the thread. Think about what that costs. It costs mobility. Once you are a history house, you cannot move. Your ancestors are under the floor. To leave them is to leave yourself. It costs innovation. You do not reorganize the kitchen. You do not redesign the layout. The new house is the old house, carefully rebuilt. It costs everything that later cities would pride themselves on being: ambition, expansion, glory. And in exchange, it buys something else. It buys a kind of belonging so dense, so multi-generational, so soaked into the plaster that modern languages have barely a word for it. It buys the knowledge that your small dark room is not a dwelling. It is an ongoing being, and you, for the decades of your own life, are not its resident. You are a phase of it. That is what held the first city together. Not law, not a king, the house itself. And when, eventually, other ways of organizing human beings were invented, when the chief and the priest and the written command arose, first in places downriver from here, later spreading everywhere, those new ways would one day swallow the world. But for 1,400 years, on a mound in central Anatolia, the house was enough. In the summer of 2025, the archaeologists opened another house. This is the part of the story that is still unfolding as we speak. The excavation team, working at Çatalhöyük, continuing the long labor that Millart began in the 1960s, and Hodder extended through the 2000s, announced in August of 2025, the discovery of what they are calling, with the caution of working scientists who do not love journalistic phrasing, but accept it when it fits, a house of the dead. The house is small. Like every other house at Çatalhöyük, it is a single windowless room, entered from the roof. It sits in one of the denser residential clusters on the eastern mound. But when the excavators reached the floor layers, they found something the site had not quite shown them before. Nearly every square meter of the floor had been excavated in antiquity for burials, and then refilled, and then excavated again, and then refilled, generation after generation, until the floor itself was less a floor than a palimpsest of small burial pits. More burials than anyone would expect for a house its size. Many more burials than the number of people who could have lived there at any one time. The ritual furniture is unusual too. Elevated platforms arranged around the room in a pattern that does not quite match an ordinary domestic layout. Concentrations of red ochre, evidence of fire, maintained at specific, non-cooking positions, and traces in some of the burials themselves of secondary interment, bodies that had been elsewhere first and brought here later. What this appears to mean, if the interpretation holds, is that Not every house at Çatalhöyük was a house in the sense we have been describing, but a small number, one, two, a few in each generation, were something else. They were houses where the community gathered for the ceremonies of death, houses that belonged to a lineage with a specific role, houses whose job across generations was to keep the ancestors. This complicates the picture a little, and it is worth sitting with the complication honestly. It means the egalitarianism of Çatalhöyük may have been a little rougher than the clean model. There may have been particular houses, particular families that carried more symbolic weight than others, even if none of them accumulated material wealth. But it doesn't break the model. It refines it. Because notice what the House of the Dead is still not. It is not a temple. It is not separated from the residential fabric of the town. It is not monumental. It is not marked on the outside. From the rooftop plaza, you could walk right past it, and unless you belong to this community, you would not know what was below your feet. The sacred at Çatalhöyük, even when it concentrated in specific houses, remained folded into the everyday. No spire, no steeple, no visible claim. Just another square of plastered clay in the honeycomb, with beneath its floor the density of a community's memory. The dig is ongoing. The interpretation will keep moving. But the discovery is a reminder of something important. Çatalhöyük is not finished talking. Half the mound has never been excavated. Layers beneath the current floors have never been reached. Every season, the site says something new. 9,000 years after the last hearth went cold, this place is still teaching us what the first city was. There is a moment about halfway through almost every visit to Çatalhöyük when the number does its work on you, and you have to stop and let it pass. 1,400 years. Say it slowly. 1,400 years. The United States of America, as of the year this script is being written, is 250 years old. The United Kingdom of Great Britain is a little older. As a political entity under its current name, is less than a century old. The Russian Federation is a generation. The Roman Empire, from the first emperor to the sack of the last capital of the West, was roughly 500 years. Even the Eastern Roman Empire, the longest continuous state most of us can name, ran about 1,000. Çatalhöyük held for 400 years longer than Rome. 70 generations. Imagine meeting your great-great-great-grandparents and then meeting theirs and theirs and theirs and going back that way in the same dark, warm, plastered room through 67 more steps and still not reaching the first hand that patted a clay brick into place on this patch of plain. Imagine being a child in Çatalhöyük in the year 6500 before the Common Era. Somebody your grandmother's age tells you a story about the old house, the first house, the house below the house you live in. Its hearth was in the same corner. Its family was your family. And the story is not a myth, it is a memory. Passed down the line of plaster, confirmed by the bones beneath your feet. Imagine looking up from that lesson and understanding with a clarity that no modern child has ever quite had, that you are part of something that has always been here and will always be here, and that if you die before your own children grow, your bones will still be here, under the next floor, under the one after that, under every floor that has not yet been laid. This is an experience of time we have almost completely lost. We move, we emigrate, we rent, we sell. Our grandparents are buried in cities we have not visited in a decade. Our childhood homes are owned by strangers. The oldest building most of us enter in a week is a church or a courthouse, and we enter it as visitors, not as descendants. Time, for us, moves forward, individual and fast. For them, time moved down through the floor, down through the layers, down through a 65-foot column of compressed living into a past that was not separate from the present, because the present was just the latest coat of plaster on a wall that had always been painted. Some part of the reason Çatalhöyük unsettles us is that it shows us with devastating clarity what we traded away when we became a civilization of forward motion. We gained so much. We gained writing and wheels and medicine and the ability to send a human voice across the ocean at the speed of light. We gained the cities we now live in. The cities with streets and plumbing and laws and lights that stay on at night. We gave up the house beneath the house beneath the house. We gave up the floor that remembered. And whether the trade was worth it is a question you have to answer for yourself every time you lie down to sleep in a room whose history you do not know. And now the hard part, because at some point, slowly, unevenly, over the course of perhaps a century and a half, Çatalhöyük empties. The dates are a little blurry, as most things at Çatalhöyük are a little blurry. The latest layers of the eastern mound, where the main habitation stood for most of its history, trail off around 6,200 before the Common Era. Later, community persists for another century or two on the western mound, across the shallow river, in a town that looks subtly different from what came before. Pottery is more common. The houses are starting to be built a little further apart, with gaps between them that something resembling an alley could pass through. The dead are not quite as reliably buried under the floors. Sometime around 6,000 before the Common Era, even that thins out. By 5,900, the mound is quiet, which had bustled with ovens and children and grinding stones for 1,400 years, are empty under the sun. Rain falls on the last layer of plaster. Wind begins its long work. Within a century, the unmaintained roofs have collapsed inward, and the houses beneath are filling up with their own rubble. The mound becomes, for the first time in its existence, what most archaeology mistakes it for. But here's the part that unsettles everyone who works at the site. We cannot find why. There is no destruction layer, no soot of burning, no scatter of arrowheads, no mass grave of the fallen. Çatalhöyük was not sacked. It was not, as far as the ground can tell us, fought over at all. There is no evidence of plague. The skeletal population in the final layers is not obviously sicker than the one that came before. There are no sudden clusters of rushed burials, no collapse in the birth rate visible in the remains of infants. People kept living. People kept dying. People were buried under the floors right up until there were no more people to lay new ones. The climate changed. Yes. There is a well-known cooling event in the eastern Mediterranean around 6,200 before the Common Era, sometimes associated with the partial emptying of Lake Agassiz far to the northwest. Rain patterns shifted. Some historians point to this as a pressure on the Konya Plain. But Çatalhöyük had weathered climate shifts before. The cooling alone does not close the case. What seems to have happened instead is subtler and in some ways more interesting. The people of Çatalhöyük began to leave in trickles. Families perhaps. Small groups of kin. They went outward from the mound, to other small settlements on the plain, to new villages further west, eventually into the stream of Neolithic migration that would carry Anatolian farmers and their genes and their sheep and their wheat and their way of building houses across the Aegean and into Europe. They did not die. They moved. And with them went something of what they had learned. Not the whole pattern. The whole pattern, the history house with its dead under the floor and its monthly white renewal, did not survive the journey intact. But pieces of it did. The tendency to build houses in tight clusters, the habit of domestic ritual, the sense of the hearth as the center, buried knowledge that home was made of more than walls. Why did they leave? The most honest answer, after a half-century of excavation, is that the way of living Çatalhöyük had invented worked extraordinarily well in the Konya Plain, for the particular ecology of that plain, for a particular population size, for as long as the rhythm held, and then for reasons that are probably a quiet accumulation of small things, rather than one dramatic cause. It stopped working well enough to hold people in one place. Maybe the soil thinned. Maybe the sheep herds grew too large for the pasture. Maybe a new style of thinking, a new way of imagining a household spread out rather than stacked, arrived from somewhere and spread like a good idea spreads. Maybe the families who held the ritual weight of the history houses had internal disagreements we will never reconstruct. Maybe it was all of that at once over generations. There is no final moment, no last woman on the ladder, except that there was. Because everything historical has a last instance, even when history does not record it. Somewhere in the 62nd century, before the Common Era, on a particular morning, a particular person climbed down for the last time from a particular roof, walked west across the plain, and did not come back. The house she had lived in stood empty behind her. The hearth went out. The plaster began its slow forgetting. She was the last person to call Çatalhöyük home in the old way, and she probably did not know it. That is the thing about endings. From inside, they rarely look like endings. They look like a decision to go visit a cousin in the next valley, and a decision to stay a while, and a decision to help build a new house over there, and a year later, a decision not to go back. The first city ended the way the first city had lived, in layers, in quiet, with no announcement. And this is the reason we are still telling the story. It did not end in silence. The DNA of the people who left Çatalhöyük is still alive. It is in the bones of the early farmers of Greece and the Balkans. It is in the ancestry of every European whose forebears settled down to wheat and bread in the Neolithic. It is, in smaller proportions, in you and in me. The genetic thread that runs through modern Europe and parts of the Mediterranean carries a measurable signature from Anatolian Neolithic communities, and Çatalhöyük is one of the great anchor sites of that signature. They did not vanish, they spread, and what they spread was not only their genes. Look at any traditional European farmhouse, from the thatched stone cottages of the Celtic fringe to the red-tiled villas of the Mediterranean. Notice what the hearth is. Notice what the threshold is. Notice what the doorframe is. The fireplace at the center of the home. The welcoming of a stranger across a threshold. The small domestic altars beside the entrance or in the kitchen corner. The sense that a particular house belongs to a particular family across generations. Every one of these is an echo. None of them come directly from Çatalhöyük. The line is not that clean. But the grammar they are written in was being worked out on that mound. Patient attention the people of the mound paid to the meaning of a single room for 1400 years. When that grammar started to travel, writing out in the bodies and habits of departing families, it would shape the way almost every later European home, almost every later Mediterranean home, almost every later Near Eastern home thought about itself. Look at any ritual, anywhere in the world that places the dead beneath the threshold of the living. Look at every rural village in Sicily, in the Balkans, in parts of Mexico, in parts of South Asia, where the ancestors are addressed by name on a particular day of the year, and their portraits hang in the main room. Look at the Chinese family altar. Look at the Roman lararium. Look at the way a grandmother's kitchen, in any culture, becomes a shrine to memory just by being cooked in for 30 years. None of these practices descend directly from Çatalhöyük. Each of them has its own local history, its own independent sources, but every one of them is answering the same question Çatalhöyük was answering. What binds a house together across time? What turns a shelter into a home? What is owed to the people who slept here before us? Çatalhöyük's answer was extreme. It put the bones in the floor. It renewed the walls every month. It held the pattern for 70 generations without writing it down. No later civilization would take it that far. But every later civilization, in some quieter way, would keep worrying at the question. There is a strange consolation in that. It means that the first city did not fail. It means that the first city was not simply a prototype that later generations improved upon. It means that the first city was a profound and successful answer to a question that we are still, 9,000 years later, asking. When you put a photograph of your grandmother on the mantelpiece, when you leave your grandfather's hammer in the drawer where he kept it, when you cook your mother's recipe on the anniversary of her death, when you paint over the scribbled-on wall where your child wrote her first name and feel something like a small, wordless hesitation as you do, you are participating in your own quieter, modern key in the practice Çatalhöyük invented, the practice of keeping the dead in the house. So come with me one more time. It is late afternoon in the year 6100, before the Common Era. A little more or a little less. The sun over the Konya Plain is going orange. The twin cone of Hasan Dağ to the south is dark against a reddening sky. A small wind is moving through the dry grass of the plain. The rooftops are still warm from the day. Most of the ovens are cold. A few smoke threads rise from 3 or 4 houses where supper is still being made. The rest of the roofs are empty. The plaster, once white, is streaked and weathered. Some of the ladders are broken. Some of the houses below are already filling with their own dust. There is one woman left in her family's house on the eastern edge of the mound. Her grandmother is under the floor. Her grandmother's grandmother is under the floor beneath that. Her own mother, who died last winter, was laid under the north platform 6 months ago, flexed and wrapped in reed, in the way the house had always done. She has decided to go. Her cousins have already gone to a smaller settlement a day's walk to the west. They have built new houses there, looser, wider, with something like a courtyard between them. They have invited her to come. It will not be the same. She knows it will not be the same. But she is tired, and the walls of this house have not been replastered in almost a year. the first time in her life, because there is nobody left to help her do it properly, and she cannot do it alone. She gathers a small bundle, a sheep's wool cloak, a handful of barley in a twist of linen, her mother's obsidian mirror, a small figurine from a grain bin, not the famous one, not a goddess, just a stylized woman with a broad belly that her grandmother had shaped with her own hands. She takes the ladder up through the hole in the roof one last time. She does not take a last look. She does not linger at the threshold. There is no threshold to linger at, only a hole in the ceiling and a ladder, and she is already through both and onto the roof. She walks west across the other roofs, most of them empty, some of them still with a pot or a broken grinding stone left behind. She climbs down the outer ladder at the edge of the mound. She puts her feet on the plain. Behind her, the first city is still standing. It is already beginning to become the ruin that it will be for 9,000 years, until a British archaeologist named James Mellard walks across this plain in 1958 and finds sticking out of a low hill a piece of painted plaster and asks himself, "What is this?" She walks west into the low sun. She does not know her name is already forgotten. She does not know that 9,000 years later, in a language that will not exist for another 8,000, a voice will describe her crossing the plain in a medium she cannot imagine, to an audience she cannot imagine, and will ask them to try to feel for a moment what it was to be her. She does not know that the story she is carrying away, the story of a house that remembered, of a floor made of ancestors, of a white wall renewed every month for the length of an empire, will survive in her bones, in her language, in the habits of her children's children, and through them in the bones and language and habits of half a continent. She does not know any of that. She knows the sun is going down. She knows her cousin's new house is a day's walk ahead. She knows the plain is open and the wind is behind her, and her mother is still under the floor, and her grandmother is still under the floor, and her grandmother's grandmother is still under the floor, and somewhere back there in the dark, warm, windowless room above them, the last coat of white plaster is drying for the last time. She walks. The first city watches her go. For the first time in 1,400 years, the rooftops are empty of everyone who ever belonged to them. The city does not call out. It does not need to. It has taught her what it needed her to learn. In a way the next 9,000 years will only slowly understand. It is going with her. This is Çatalhöyük, the first city, the mound that remembered. And if this story has made you, for even a moment, look differently at the room you are sitting in, at the walls, at the floor, at the particular patch of ground that you have decided, for now, is yours, then the woman on the ladder has done her work again. Thank you for walking through the first city with me. The echoes, as always, go on.